What if I told you that one of the most brutal sieges in history, one drenched in blood and violence, was almost erased from the pages of history? A battle so savage that even Rome, the empire that defined history, tried to hide it. The truth is, there are moments in time so gruesome, so horrifying, that even the victors, afraid of their own actions, choose to bury them. But what if the story you've been told about ancient Rome isn't the whole story? What if there's a dark chapter, hidden away, waiting to be uncovered? For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as a symbol of might, wealth, and invincibility. Rome's legions conquered lands far and wide, stretching their influence across the known world. Rome's citizens reveled in a sense of superiority. They were untouchable, invulnerable. Yet, for all its strength, Rome was not impervious to the devastating forces of war. Rome was built on conflict, and conflict is often a double-edged sword. While the empire's soldiers were fierce, their enemies could be just as relentless. The Roman Empire, despite its grandeur, had its moments of peril, moments where it stood on the brink of collapse. One such moment was the siege of a city so close to Rome's borders that its fall could have meant the beginning of the end for the empire. The year was 68 BC, and the once unshakable might of Rome was faced with an enemy so ferocious it brought the empire to its knees. The city in question wasn't some backwater settlement. It was a powerful force, strategically placed to challenge Roman dominance. And the siege that would follow would be like no other in Roman history. But what was it about this siege that made it so horrifying? Was it the sheer brutality of the attackers? Or was it the vicious tactics employed by the Romans themselves, desperate to hold on to their power at any cost? The reality is much darker. The attack was swift, violent, and shockingly savage. In a city known for its advanced defenses, even the Romans had to admit that this time they might not win. And as the blood ran through the streets, the survivors, the soldiers, the leaders, they all knew this was a battle that would stain their legacies forever. In a moment, I will reveal the true extent of the carnage that took place here. But before we do that, we need to understand just how a world power like Rome could fall victim to such a brutal siege. What made this attack so unique? And why is it that we're only now starting to uncover the truth behind it? Stay with me as we unravel the secrets of one of the bloodiest sieges the Roman Empire ever faced. Secrets that had been buried for centuries. Secrets that might change everything you thought you knew about Rome. Before we dive in, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. This is just the beginning of the untold stories that will reshape your understanding of history. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. To understand how this siege unfolded, we need to take a step back. We need to look at Rome's situation at the time, not as the empire at its peak, but as an empire that was beginning to show cracks. It was the 1st century BC. The Roman Republic had reached its zenith in terms of territorial expansion. Rome stretched from the wind-swept hills of Britain to the burning deserts of Egypt. The Roman legions, feared and respected across the known world, were regarded as the finest fighting force ever assembled. But behind that power, cracks were beginning to appear. The Republic was facing increasing internal turmoil. The growing divide between the ruling elite and the common people, the rise of populist leaders, and the widespread corruption had begun to weaken the once unified empire. On top of this, Rome was facing threats on multiple fronts: barbarians in the north, revolts in the east, and new enemies that seemed to emerge out of nowhere. And then, just as Rome was distracted by internal strife and external threats, a new player emerged, a rival city-state that would put Rome's entire strategy to the test. The city of Numidia, a Berber kingdom in North Africa, was fast becoming a thorn in Rome's side. The Romans had long sought to expand their control over the region, seeing it as crucial to maintaining their dominance over the western Mediterranean. But the Numidians, led by their fierce king, Jugurtha, were not the typical enemies Rome was used to fighting. Jugurtha was a master of warfare, skilled in both strategy and diplomacy. He knew how to exploit Roman weaknesses, and he understood that brute force wasn't always the answer. What made Jugurtha so dangerous wasn't just his military prowess, It was his ability to navigate the political chaos in Rome. Through bribes, alliances, and a deep understanding of Roman politics, Jugurtha was able to weaken Rome from within. Jugurtha's ability to manipulate Roman senators, buying loyalty and undermining authority, allowed him to hold on to his power despite repeated Roman attempts to subdue him. Eventually, after years of negotiations, skirmishes, and power plays, Jugurtha's actions would lead to a full-scale conflict. This, however, was not just any conflict. It was the beginning of a military and political struggle that would tear apart Rome's reputation. Jugurtha's forces, though not as large as the Roman legions, knew how to strike quickly and decisively. And that was enough to put Rome on the back foot. The story of the siege begins with a relatively small but strategically significant city in North Africa, Cirta. Cirta was a thriving city that had fallen under Jugurtha's control. Despite its relative size, it held enormous value. For Jugurtha, it was a key stronghold, a symbol of his ability to defy Roman power. The Romans, seeking to restore their dignity and reclaim control of the region, marched toward Cirta with a full legion. The siege would begin, and for the Romans, it was supposed to be just another victory in a long line of conquests. But things quickly went wrong. The Romans underestimated the strength of Jugurtha's defenders. Despite having more manpower, the Romans found themselves struggling against the fierce Numidian resistance. Cirta's defenders, led by commanders loyal to Jugurtha, held their ground with surprising strength. The Roman legions, so used to overwhelming their enemies, were caught off guard. The siege was quickly becoming a battle of attrition. As the siege wore on, the Romans made a critical mistake. They believed their superior numbers and tactics would eventually break the defenders, but the Numidians fought with desperation. The Romans, once confident in their ability to starve out the enemy, began to face mounting casualties. The longer the siege dragged on, the more brutal it became. The Roman commanders were forced to make tough decisions, which only worsened their situation. They sent in more troops, but they didn't anticipate the horrors that lay ahead. In a desperate bid to force a surrender, the Romans began using increasingly ruthless tactics, attacking civilians, setting fire to crops, and engaging in ruthless psychological warfare. It was during this time that the full scale of the horrors of the siege began to unfold. The bloodshed grew beyond anything the Romans had anticipated. In the midst of this chaos, the siege began to take on a life of its own. The horror escalated, and what started as a battle for control of a city turned into something far darker, a fight for survival, for dignity, and for the very soul of the empire. But in the end, who would survive? Would the Romans break through, as they had so many times before, or would they fall victim to the same destructive force they had unleashed on so many others? Stay with me, because what happened next will change everything you thought you knew about the Roman Empire. In the next chapter of this story, we'll uncover the shocking events that took place during the final days of the siege. But be warned, the bloodshed that followed will challenge your understanding of how far an empire can go to maintain control. As the days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months, the situation at Cirta grew increasingly dire. The Romans, confident that their superior numbers and military tactics would eventually bring victory, found themselves caught in a battle unlike any they had experienced before. The city, though not large by Roman standards, had a strategic position that made it incredibly difficult to breach. The Numidians were determined to defend it at all costs. And so, the Roman commanders, unwilling to admit defeat, began to push their forces harder, making critical decisions that would ultimately determine the fate of the siege. But despite their might, the Romans were slowly beginning to realize the true scale of their enemy's resolve. At first, the siege followed the traditional Roman script: encircle the city, cut off supplies, and starve the defenders into submission. But the Numidians, led by their relentless commanders, held strong. They had fortified their defenses and were well prepared for such tactics. What began as a strategic maneuver soon turned into a war of attrition, one that took a far heavier toll on the Romans than they had anticipated. The Romans responded in kind, using more and more aggressive tactics. They began launching brutal night raids, setting fire to the surrounding countryside and destroying everything that could support the defenders. But this only fueled the Numidians' resolve. Each Roman attempt to break through was met with vicious counterattacks, each more deadly than the last. It was not just a battle for the city anymore, it was a battle for survival. The very nature of war was being tested, and for the Romans, it was beginning to feel less like a siege and more like an execution. Days turned into weeks, and the conditions within the Roman camp began to deteriorate. As the siege dragged on, food and supplies dwindled. The soldiers who had marched with confidence and optimism at the start of the siege began to feel the weight of their situation. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion began to ravage the Roman legions. In the heat of the African summer, sickness spread like wildfire, and many of the Roman soldiers who had once been at the height of their strength were now too weak to fight. The Romans, who had once held the upper hand, now found themselves in a race against time. The longer the siege continued, the more brutal the fighting became. And yet, despite their increasing losses, the Roman commanders pressed on. What made this siege so deadly wasn't just the sheer brutality. It was Jugurtha's ability to use Rome's own tactics against them. While the Romans were known for their military genius, Jugurtha, though not as numerically superior, was a master of unconventional warfare. He knew that a full-on confrontation with the Roman legions was a battle he couldn't win. Instead, he played the long game. Jugurtha used guerrilla tactics to harass the Romans, launching surprise attacks on their supply lines, ambushing patrols, and setting traps in the harsh terrain surrounding the city. These tactics, which would later become a hallmark of many guerrilla movements throughout history, were designed not only to weaken the Romans physically, but to break their morale. The Roman soldiers, once proud and confident, began to doubt whether they would survive this siege. As the Romans pressed harder, the toll on both sides grew heavier. The defenders of Cirta, though committed, were not invincible. Jugurtha had promised them victory, but even his forces were beginning to feel the pressure. The Romans, desperate and out of options, began to resort to increasingly violent methods to try and break the city's defenses. One of the most horrific episodes of the siege came when the Romans, in a last-ditch attempt to break the deadlock, launched an assault on the city's walls. With siege engines in place, they pounded the gates, hoping to create an opening for their infantry to pour in. But the defenders fought tooth and nail, each soldier willing to die for their homeland. What followed was nothing short of a bloodbath. As the Romans breached the gates, they were met with an unrelenting defense that turned the streets of Cirta into a slaughterhouse. The streets ran red with the blood of both Roman soldiers and Numidian defenders. Amidst the carnage, stories of personal bravery and sacrifice began to emerge. Both Roman and Numidian soldiers fought not just for their commanders, but for something much deeper: honor, survival, and pride. Among the Romans there were soldiers who had once believed in the glory of Rome, but now they fought simply to stay alive. Some of them had even begun to question the legitimacy of the siege. Were they fighting for Rome's glory, or were they merely pawns in a war that had spiraled out of control? On the other side, the defenders, led by their commanders, continued to resist, even when it seemed like the city would fall. They fought with a desperation that was as much about survival as it was about defiance. One particularly heroic figure emerged from the chaos: a young Numidian warrior who, despite overwhelming odds, fought off several Roman soldiers at the city's gates, allowing others to escape. His bravery would later become a symbol of the siege and inspire countless others to continue the fight. The Roman commanders, realizing that they were losing the war of attrition, began to debate their next moves. The siege was no longer about military might. It was about who could outlast the other. In the face of mounting casualties, disease, and the threat of an enemy that seems to never stop fighting, the Roman generals were forced to ask themselves, was this siege worth the cost? Would the glory of Rome be worth the lives of so many? Would they be able to reclaim the city, or was this the moment that would expose the limits of Roman power? The siege was nearing its breaking point. The Romans were at a crossroads. The next few days would determine not just the fate of Cirta, but the future of Rome itself. The brutality of the siege would soon reach its apex, and what would happen next would shock even the most seasoned veterans of war. In the next part of this story, we'll reveal the final days of the siege and the horrifying events that followed. The bloodshed will only intensify, and the true cost of this conflict will be exposed. Stay tuned, because the darkest chapters of this siege are yet to come. We're just getting started. By now, the siege had dragged on for what seemed like an eternity. Both sides were exhausted, the land around Cirta was scarred with the remnants of battle, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The once proud Roman legions, men who had marched confidently into battle, were now reduced to a shadow of their former selves. Starving, diseased, and demoralized, they could hardly even recognize the glory of their cause. The Numidians, too, were weary. Their defenses were weakening, their numbers dwindling, yet their spirits remained unbroken. The city's defenders fought on with a ferocity born of desperation. They knew this would be their last stand. If they fell, they would die fighting for their homes, their families, and their king. The Romans had been pushing them for weeks, yet they couldn't break the will of the defenders. The walls of Cirta, though battered and scarred by the relentless siege, still stood. The people inside had learned to adapt to the constant pressure, the ongoing threat of death hanging over them. But how much longer could they hold out? At the Roman camp, the commanders were facing a dilemma. Every Roman general had their own view of how the siege should end, but all knew the cost was becoming unbearable. The war had already claimed the lives of thousands of their soldiers. The once confident legions were on the verge of collapse. In a desperate move, the Romans decided to escalate the siege even further. They would go all in. They would flood the city's water supply, destroy the last remaining stores of food, and launch one final assault. The Romans, as always, relied on their superior training and tactics, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about defeating the enemy, it was about breaking their spirit, wiping out any hope the defenders had left. In their final push, the Romans used siege engines in ways never before seen. They hurled massive stones into the city, some large enough to crush entire buildings. Catapults sent burning tar into the streets, setting fire to everything in their path. The air was filled with the sound of clashing metal, the screams of dying soldiers, and the desperate cries of civilians caught in the crossfire. But the Numidians didn't give up. They fought like animals cornered in a trap. It was their final stand, no surrender, no retreat. It was a matter of life or death, and they were determined to make the Romans pay for every inch they gained. The streets of Cirta were soon flooded with blood. Roman soldiers clashed with the city's defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Romans pushed into the narrow alleys, but the defenders fought back with knives, spears, and anything they could get their hands on. Men, women, and children alike were drawn into the madness, as the Romans showed no mercy to the city's inhabitants. One of the most haunting moments came when Roman soldiers stormed the city's gates, only to find themselves trapped in a labyrinth of narrow streets and alleyways. The defenders, prepared for the worst, turned the very streets into traps. Roman soldiers were dragged into buildings and slaughtered in close combat, where their superior numbers didn't matter. The carnage reached horrific levels, as both sides fought with everything they had left. There was no honor in this battle, only survival. Finally, after days of relentless assault, the Romans breached the walls. With one last charge, they overwhelmed the defenders who had fought so valiantly. As they pushed through the broken gates and into the heart of Cirta, they were met not with the surrender they had expected, but with the last, desperate stand of the Numidian defenders. The city's fate was sealed, but the price of victory was steep. The Romans had lost more men in the final days of the siege than they had in the preceding months. The defenders of Cirta, though outnumbered, had held their ground until the very end, and as the Romans swept through the streets, they found that the price of their victory was not just the lives of the defenders, but the lives of the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. When the dust settled, Cirta was no more. The once thriving city lay in ruins, its streets littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, defenders, and innocents alike. The Romans had won, but they had paid a price unlike any other battle in their storied history. The Roman commanders, who had originally seen this siege as another victory to add to their list, could not escape the reality of what they had done. The brutality of the siege, the slaughter that followed, and the suffering endured by both sides left an indelible mark on the Roman psyche. This was not a clean victory. It was a massacre, a tragedy that would haunt the Romans for years to come. The bloodshed had stained Rome's hands, and it was something the empire would try to bury. But why did this siege fade into obscurity? Why did the empire that conquered so much, that documented every victory and every battle, choose to ignore this blood-soaked chapter of its history? The truth is, Rome had a very specific image it wanted to portray to the world. It didn't want to be seen as weak or capable of atrocities. The brutality of Cirta and the terrible decisions made by Roman commanders during the siege were not something Rome wanted the world to remember. They wanted to be seen as an empire of glory, honor, and military genius, not one that committed atrocities to achieve victory. And so, like many uncomfortable truths in history, the siege of Cirta was swept under the rug, left to fade into the shadows of time. Though Rome tried to bury the story of Cirta, the reality of what happened there could not be hidden forever. The legacy of this siege was far-reaching. It showed the world that even the most powerful empires are not immune to the consequences of their actions. But more importantly, the siege of Cirta left a scar on those who survived. The soldiers who returned to Rome from the battlefields of Cirta, haunted by the memories of the bloodshed, would carry the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives. In the end, Cirta was just one of many forgotten sieges and hidden chapters of history. But its lessons are profound. No empire, no matter how mighty, is beyond the consequences of its actions. The bloodshed that took place in Cirta was a dark moment in Roman history, one that will continue to haunt the empire's legacy. And as we look back on this siege, we must ask ourselves, what price do we pay for power? And how much blood is too much when it comes to victory? If you found this story shocking, if you're intrigued by the untold tales of history that have been buried over time, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We have more dark and forgotten stories of the past that will challenge everything you think you know. What do you think of Rome's legacy? Was the price of their empire worth the bloodshed? Let us know in the comments below. The victory at Cirta, though celebrated by some, carried a price that the Romans themselves were reluctant to acknowledge. In the wake of the siege, Rome's imperial image remained intact in the eyes of the world, but it came at the cost of something far darker. The legacy of this brutal siege left a scar not only on the people of Cirta, but on the Roman soldiers who had been a part of the carnage. For those who survived, the victory felt hollow. The brutal methods used during the siege, the destruction, the slaughter of civilians, the cruelty towards captives, were a bitter reminder of the lengths the Romans had gone to secure their power. And even though Rome emerged victorious, the victory felt like defeat to many who were left to pick up the pieces. For the Roman soldiers who had fought at Cirta, the horrors of the siege would remain etched in their minds. These men, trained for battle but not for such extreme brutality, were forever changed. Many of them would return to Rome, only to find that they were unable to escape the psychological toll of the events they had witnessed. The images of those last brutal days in Cirta, the bloodied streets, the desperate fight for survival, haunted them. In Rome, the stories of those who returned from the siege were swept under the rug. The soldiers were not greeted as heroes, but as men who had participated in an action so savage that it threatened to undermine the empire's carefully crafted image of honor and justice. Those who had participated in the massacre became shadows of their former selves, burdened by guilt and shame. The Roman Senate, which had authorized the campaign, chose to remain silent in the aftermath. There was no grand public acknowledgement of the atrocities that had been committed. There was no attempt to bring those responsible for the massacre to justice. Instead, Rome chose to move forward, leaving Cirta behind in the dust. This silence was perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of the aftermath. The Roman Empire, in its attempt to maintain the image of unyielding power and righteousness, chose to hide the truth of the siege, hoping that time would erase the bloodshed and the suffering that had defined it. On the other side, the Numidian defenders, who had fought to the last breath, were left to fade into history without recognition. While Rome moved on, the memory of those who fought and died in Cirta was slowly erased from the historical narrative. The bravery of the Numidians, their unrelenting will to defend their home, was largely ignored by the historical record. The few survivors of Cirta were left with nothing but the scars of battle and the knowledge that they had fought for a cause that would soon be forgotten. But the legacy of Cirta did not end with the fall of the city. The events that transpired there had far-reaching consequences for the Roman Empire. The brutality of the siege was a warning sign, an early indicator that Rome's expansion had limits. The cost of maintaining such a vast empire, the countless lives lost in conquest, and the moral compromises made in the name of power would eventually take their toll on Rome. The empire that had conquered the known world was beginning to show signs of decay. The same bloodshed that had built Rome's power was now the poison slowly eroding it from within. This was not just a military conflict, it was a turning point, a moment in history where the foundations of the empire were cracked, and the cracks would only grow wider as time went on. As we look back on the siege of Cirta, we are left with an uncomfortable question. What is the true cost of empire? Rome built its greatness on war, conquest, and bloodshed. But at what price? The siege of Cirta was one of the most brutal chapters in Roman history, and yet it was nearly erased from the record. Why? Because it exposed the ugly side of empire, one of cruelty, destruction, and the willingness to sacrifice everything in the name of power. This siege, though forgotten by most, is a powerful reminder that no empire is without its sins. Rome, despite its glory, was built on blood, and the price of that blood was something no one, not even the Romans themselves, wanted to remember. History is full of moments that are hidden from view, buried beneath the weight of time and convenience. But the siege of Cirta is one of those moments that refuses to stay hidden. It challenges the myth of Roman invincibility and reminds us that the path to empire is paved with blood and sacrifice. As we reflect on the siege, we must ask ourselves, what do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to forget? If you found this story as shocking as we did and want to uncover more forgotten histories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There are countless untold stories from the past, stories of war, betrayal, and the cost of power that still have much to teach us today. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the dark chapters of history. What do you think about the cost of empires like Rome? Was their power worth the blood they spilled? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.